So we've talked about how to determine if hosts are online. Next step is to determine what services are up and running on those hosts. Common tools for that, Nmap and hping. However, we're not going to be looking specifically at the operation of these tools here. We need to look at the methods for scanning for services. We see here on this slide several service scanning techniques that are common, from full open down to inverse TCP flags and ACK flag. We're going to run through all of these individually so we can get an understanding of how they work. However, before we do that, we need to talk about TCP and UDP. So there's two common routed layer 4 protocols. So we have routing protocols and routed protocols. Routing versus routed. Routed protocols are protocols that are routed around networks. Most of the time it's either TCP or UDP. Other examples of routed protocols, ICMP, GRE for generic routing encapsulation, etc. IPsec protocols are routed protocols. Routing protocols operate at layer 3 most of the time, and they exchange information between routers in order to say, hey, if you need to get to IP address A, then you should come to me and I know how to get there. Examples of routing protocols, RIP, OSPF, EIGRP, BGP, etc. So specifically, transmission control protocol and user datagram protocol. TCP, IP protocol 6, if you recall from your studies about the OSI model, so we have layers 1 through 7, TCP and UDP operate at layer 4. Just below that, layer 3 are where packets happen. Layer 4 is the transport layer. And as you are encapsulating data as you go up the stack, you have the IP protocol happening at layer 3. IP protocol will have a number. That number tells the operating system that's receiving this particular piece of information how to interpret the data. So IP protocol 6, that tells us that the layer 4 information should be interpreted as TCP, as a TCP segment. UDP, on the other hand, IP protocol 17. The primary difference between TCP and UDP is the connection-oriented nature of the two protocols. With TCP, we're actually going to establish a session with the host to exchange information. That requires us to synchronize information prior to actually sending the data. UDP is fire and forget. You compose a datagram, you put it on the wire, and you send it. Off it goes. You might get a response, you might not. So TCP has a session establishment phase, UDP does not. For TCP, I mentioned there was a session establishment that had to occur. So in this slide here, we see that host A wants to talk to host B. In this case, it's 8.8.8.8, and host A is 10.1.1.10. In order for them to establish a channel to talk to each other, they need to synchronize what are called sequence numbers. Sequence numbers are just another piece of data that sits in that layer 4 protocol header, in this case TCP. And that sequence number informs the remote system where it thinks it knows the data is. So I have received segments 0 through 100. My sequence number might be 100. So you can send me 101. Okay? So we see in this example here, SYN, ACK, ACK. That is the common terminology used for the three-way handshake. SYN, ACK, ACK. And we see what's happening here. We're doing a synchronize, saying my initial sequence number, ISN, is 100. The receiving host, host B in this case, is going to respond and say, I acknowledge your initial sequence number. Here's my initial sequence number, sequence 200. That final ACK that gets sent from host A will acknowledge that initial sequence number from host B. So we see here ACK 201, it's always going to be +1. I would recommend, when you get through the sniffing section of this course, go in there and start sniffing some TCP sessions. And look at the sequence numbers, because you'll see that +1, and then it receives more data, and then it's +1 from that amount of received data. Those sequence numbers, though, are going to be really big. So I believe it's 4 bytes in that TCP header. I'd have to look to verify. I'm pretty sure it's 4 bytes for the sequence numbers. And in just a quick tangent here, when you're looking at your sniffer, particularly Wireshark, you can do relative sequence numbers, and it'll cut it down from really large numbers to something that's a little bit more manageable for humans. Okay, TCP flags. So TCP uses these flags you'll see two on here that we've already talked about, synchronize and acknowledge. There's 4 other flags. There's 6 in total: send, act, fin, push, urgent, and reset. And these flags, there's 6 bits in the TCP header. And if that bit is set to on, then that flag is set. This is another thing you can see from a sniffer. So take a look at it. Running through these real quick. Send, synchronize. This tells the other system that we want to synchronize sequence numbers with them. Acknowledgements are used all over the place. As a segment comes in, that receiving host will send an acknowledgement that it received it. And you can have bidirectional data transfer doing this just by validating the sequence numbers as they're exchanged. We have fin. Fin is for finish. This is for a system to tell the other host that it's done. Like, I'm done with you, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. Next up is push. Push tells the sending system to send this data immediately up the stack. Similarly, urgent does the same thing. So fin is, we've had a nice conversation, I'll see you later, and reset is, get out of my face, I'm done with you. Okay? The tools used that we mentioned in the previous lesson, we had Nmap and HPing. Nmap here, Nmap Network Mapper, written a long time ago, 1997, is used for discovering live hosts, operating system detection, service discovery, and service version discovery, available at nmap.org. And for packet crafting, we have HPing. So we've touched on Nmap and we've touched on HPing in the previous lesson, touching on it again here because these are the tools that you're primarily going to use in order to do this scanning, this available service scanning.